The term and concept of teenager entered American life after World War II. The 15 years following World War II saw unprecedented attention to America's adolescence. Deep fears were expressed about everything from teenage sexuality and juvenile delinquency to young people's driving habits, hairstyles, and choices of clothing. At the same time, advertisers and businesses pursued the disposable income of America's affluent youth with a vengeance, indirectly promoting growth of youth culture. The children born in those years had by the late 1950s grown into the original teenagers, the oldest siblings of the celebrated baby boomers of 1946 to 1964. Together, the demographic growth of teens and the post-war economic expansion created a burgeoning youth market with $10 billion in disposable income by 1959. Specialized market research organizations such as Eugene Gilbert and Company and Teen Age Survey Incorporated sprang up to serve business clients eager to attract teen consumers and install brand loyalty. To many parents, the emerging youth culture, especially rock and roll and the immorality it encouraged, was a dangerous threat to their authority. The increasing uniformity of public school education also contributed to the public recognition of the special status of teenagers. Dorothy Barak's How to Live with Your Teenager in 1953 and Paul Landis's Understanding Teenagers in 1955 were popular guidebooks for parents, while the marketplace, schools, child-rearing manuals, the mass media all reinforced the notion of teenagers' status as a special community. The growing teen market and the expansion of television and car radios created new marketing and entertainment opportunities. Ray Charles, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, and Little Richard, African-American rhythm and blues artists, recorded for small independent labels which expanded beyond their black base, reaching millions of white teenagers through radio, jukeboxes, and record stores. The big labels largely ignored the new phenomena, except for pallid covers, which often outsold the originals. There were limits to how closely white kids could identify with black performers. Some disc jockeys refused to play cover versions and attracted enthusiastic audiences of both black and white young people, with Alan Freed, who popularized the term rock and roll, leading the way with radio shows and live concerts. As a rock and roll performer and recording artist, Elvis Presley challenged the lines separating black music from white, and pop from rhythm and blues for country, reinventing American popular music in the process, and opening the way for white rock and rollers, many of them Southerners, such as Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, and the Everly Brothers and Roy Orbison. Chuck Berry, a black singer-songwriter, broke through in Elvis's wake to become wildly popular and successful, redefining what it meant to be young in post-war America with songs like School Days, Memphis, and Maybelline. Many adults held rock and roll responsible for the apparent decline in parental control over teens, while white Southerners suspected the music of bringing together white women and black men. At the same time, gang fights, drug and alcohol abuse, car theft, sexual offenses, and other forms of juvenile delinquency seemed to be on the rise, probably telling us more about anxieties over family life and the erosion of adult authority than about crime patterns, all magnified by media attention. In 1954, psychiatrist Fred Wortham published Seduction of the Innocent, arguing that crime comic books incited youngsters to crime. In The Wild One in 1954, Marlon Brando played an unsavory motorcycle gang leader. In Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, James Dean, Natalie Wood, and Sal Mineo played emotionally troubled youths in an affluent California suburb. While parents wrung their hands over teen morals, Brando and Dean, along with Elvis, became role models and heroes. Developed in the 1930s, TV came into its own as the dominant mass media after the war, and by 1960, 90% of families had a set and watched it 5 hours a day. TV defined and shaped culture in ways other media never had, simultaneously reinforcing and challenging conformity, status, and materialism. The three main television networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, grew directly from radio, and nearly all broadcast stations were network affiliates. Television and advertising developed a symbiotic relationship. Although TV, like radio, was supported by advertising, the higher cost of TV time led sponsors to buy scattered time slots rather than bankrolling an entire show. Earlier TV, like The Milton Berle Show, was a radio variety show with pictures when it premiered in 1948, and many, often ethnic comedies and dramas followed this pattern. For a brief time, original life drama flourished on writer-oriented shows, such as Goodyear Television Playhouse and Studio One. By the late 1950s, TV had become more homogenized, and all the urban ethnic comedy shows were off the air. Shows aimed specifically at children, such as Howdy Doody, pulled kids into the television orbit at an early age, while TV's power to create overnight crazes ran from Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show to Davy Crockett, the latter pioneering the market tie-in with $300 million in shirts, toys, and coonskin caps sold. Primetime shows avoided references to political issues for fear of alienating sponsors or alarming self-appointed anti-communist watchdogs. As in Hollywood, the Cold War restricted the range of political discussion on television. Any honest treatment of the conflicts in American society threatened the consensus mentality at the heart of the business. Even public affairs and documentary programs were largely devoid of substantial political debate. Television made Democratic Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee a national political figure through live coverage of his 1951 Senate investigation into organized crime. The 1952 election brought the first use of TV political advertising for presidential candidates. The Republican Party hired a high-powered ad agency to create a series of short, sophisticated advertisements touting Dwight D. Eisenhower and setting the precedent for TV's impact on electoral politics. The urge to denounce the mass media for degrading the quality of American life united radical and conservative critics. Vance Packard's The Hidden Persuaders in 1957 highlighted advertisers' exploitation of human psychology. Critics of mass culture argued that the audiences for the mass media were atomized, anonymous, and detached, ignoring the statistics that showed most Americans watch TV in groups and social settings. Led by novelist Jack Kerouac and the poet Allen Ginsberg, the Beats shared a distrust of the American virtues of progress, power, and material gain. The Beats' sensibility celebrated spontaneity, friendship, jazz, open sexuality, drug use, and the outcasts of American society. Kerouac, born and raised in a working-class French-Canadian family in Lowell, Massachusetts, coined the term beat in 1948. At a 1955 poetry reading in San Francisco, Ginsberg introduced his epic poem Howl to a wildly enthusiastic audience. Beat writers received a largely antagonistic, even virulent reception from the literary establishment. The mass media soon managed to trivialize the Beats, but their work foreshadowed the 1960s counterculture and youth rebellion. No one could have resembled Dwight Eisenhower less in personality, temperament, and public image than John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the handsome son of a prominent, wealthy Irish-American diplomat, husband of a fashionable, trend-setting heiress. 42-year-old JFK embodied youth, excitement, and sophistication. Only the second Catholic candidate for president, Kennedy ran under the banner of the New Frontier, inspiring idealism and hope in millions of young people at home and abroad, and his presidency seemed to embody the call of a new sense of national purpose beyond simply enjoying affluence. In foreign affairs, Kennedy was a traditional Cold Warrior, but may have been softening his position by the time of his death. After representing Massachusetts in the House and Senate since 1946, Kennedy won the Democratic nomination over Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon B. Johnson by stressing his intellect, youth, and his image as a war hero. Vice President Richard Nixon was better known and more experienced, but in the first televised national presidential debate, Kennedy's confident manner and telegenic good looks made him more appealing than the nervous and ill-looking Nixon. Both candidates emphasized foreign policy. Nixon defended the Republican record and stressed his own maturity and experience. Kennedy hammered away at the alleged missile gap with the Soviet Union and promised more vigorous executive leadership. Kennedy squeaked to victory in the closest election since 1884. The new administration promised to be exciting and stylish, a modern-day Camelot, peopled by heroic young men and women. And here we see JFK and Richard Nixon during the second of 3 televised debates held during the 1960 election campaign. Statistics record 85 million viewers watching at least one of these televised debates. Here we have the election map from 1960. JFK with an electoral vote of 303, or 56%. Just before Kennedy took office, Eisenhower delivered a farewell address warning of the dangers of the military-industrial complex, which his own policies had, wittingly or unwittingly, helped to create. Despite the military buildup and a series of confrontations with the Soviets, Ike left America no more secure than he had found it, in a telling demonstration of the limits of power and Cold War assumptions. Kennedy hoped to revive the long-stalled liberal domestic agenda, advocating a higher minimum wage, greater federal aid for education, and increased Social Security benefits, medical care for the elderly, support for public housing, and various anti-poverty measures. Much of his agenda was blocked or cut back by conservative Democrats in Congress. More successful was the Peace Corps, with idealistic young volunteers providing assistance to Third World nations. Kennedy addressed women's rights with his Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, led by Eleanor Roosevelt, which called for a range of reforms in federal programs, and he directed executive agencies to prohibit sex discrimination in federal hiring and promotion. The administration pushed lower business taxes through Congress, even at the cost of a higher federal deficit. Kennedy also increased the federal commitment to a wholly new realm of government spending, the space program. Greater use of the White House staff increased Kennedy's authority, since these appointees, unlike cabinet secretaries, escaped congressional oversight, but intensified a pattern of presidents operating through small groups of fiercely loyal aides, often in secret. As mentioned earlier, Kennedy began as a Cold War hawk, committed to containment. To head the State Department, Kennedy chose Dean Rusk, a conservative former assistant to Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. Allen Dulles, Eisenhower's CIA director, remained at his post. Defense appropriations continued to grow, as did covert operations, often involving the new elite Green Beret Special Forces. Not all of these efforts succeeded. In Laos, the CIA-backed government could not defeat Soviet-backed Pathet Lao guerrillas. When Communist Viet Cong guerrillas launched a civil war in South Vietnam against the US-supported Saigon government, Kennedy sent thousands of Green Berets and other military advisors to support the rule of Diem and ordered a covert action against Ho Chi Minh's government that included sabotage and intelligence gathering, with little impact. Kennedy's approach to Vietnam reflected a Cold War analysis of General Maxwell Taylor's and Walt Rostow. By 1963, 16,000 support and combat troops were in South Vietnam, and Kennedy acquiesced in a CIA-backed coup that overthrew the unpopular and ineffective Diem regime. In Latin America, Kennedy unveiled the Alliance for Progress, a 10-year, $100 billion economic development program. The idealistic program raised growth rates in Latin America, but little of the benefit trickled down to the poor, and democracy made very little gain. In 1959, the oppressive Batista regime in Cuba, which had long and deep ties to American business, was overthrown by a seemingly populist movement led by Fidel Castro. When the United States withdrew economic aid in response to Castro's land reform program, Cuba turned to the Soviets for aid. Eisenhower established an economic boycott of Cuba in 1960 and then severed diplomatic relations. Kennedy inherited from Eisenhower plans for a U.S. invasion of Cuba by secretly armed and trained anti-Castro exiles. Kennedy approved the operation but refused Air Force cover at the last minute. At the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, Castro's efficient and loyal army easily subdued them. Despite CIA predictions, there was no popular uprising against Castro. As Castro stifled internal opposition, many Cuban intellectuals and professionals fled to the United States. American liberals criticized Kennedy for plotting Castro's overthrow, while conservatives blamed him for not supporting the invasion. The CIA continued to support anti-Castro operations and launched at least 8 attempts to assassinate the Cuban leader. Khrushchev responded to the Bay of Pigs incident in the summer of 1962 by sending intermediate-range nuclear missiles to Cuba. After U-2 flight revealed the missile batteries, Kennedy went on national television to announce the discovery, demand removal of all missiles, and order a naval blockade of Cuba. After tense negotiations, Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles in return for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, while Kennedy secretly assured Khrushchev that he would dismantle obsolete Chpt missiles in Turkey. On November 20th, Kennedy publicly announced the withdrawal of Soviet missiles and bombers from Cuba. Soviet relations continued a mild thaw with the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in August 1963, prohibiting above-ground, outer space, and underwater nuclear weapons tests. Kennedy may have also been reconsidering the commitment to Vietnam, but his death meant we will never know what he might have done had he been re-elected in 1964. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas on November 22, 1963, sent the entire nation into shock and mourning. Millions had identified his strengths, intelligence, optimism, wit, charm, and coolness under fire as those of American society. In life, Kennedy had helped place television at the center of American political life. Now, in the aftermath of his death, television riveted a badly shocked nation. One day after the assassination of the president's accused killer, an obscure political misfit named Lee Harvey Oswald was himself gunned down before national television, cameras covering his arraignment in Dallas. 2 days later, tens of millions watched the televised spectacle of Kennedy's funeral, trying to make sense of the brutal murder. Although a special commission headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren found the killing to be the work of Oswald acting alone, many Americans doubted this conclusion. Kennedy's death gave rise to a host of conspiracy theories, none of which seemed provable. Much of the domestic liberal agenda of the new frontier would finally be implemented by Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, who dreamed of creating a great society.